The lookout never saw it until the horizon flashed. It was late morning on May 4th, 1982, the South Atlantic rolling in long, cold swells, and the Type 42 destroyer HMS Sheffield was cutting southeast at a steady 15 knots. The sea was clean sky blue and white streaks of wind. Inside the operations room, the satellite communications circuit had just gone up, and the room was quieter than it should have been on a war footing. A screen blinked. Someone said they had a possible track: low, fast, intermittent. 2 Argentine super etendards had launched, each shouldering a single AM-39 Exocet. One of those missiles skimmed the water at wave-top height. Seeker had locked, riding the radar horizon. It closed from the northwest, invisible until it was suddenly there. The warning came with seconds to spare. The electronic warfare set chattered, the ops room snapped to life, and voices overlapped. Designate the threat, chaff, sea dart. Then the first missile passed astern of another ship and held its line. Sheffield never got a missile away. The Exocet struck starboard amidships, a little aft of the bridge, between the operations room and the forward engine room, just above the waterline. Men on the mess decks felt the shock as a hard, short punch, no violent blast, just a shove and a shiver that ran through steel. The warhead likely did not detonate fully. The missile's fuel did. Atomized kerosene burst into the ship and became a rolling, pressurized flame that sprinted through cable runs and compartments not built to stop it. Fire chased air. Smoke thickened instantly into a choking plastic stench that bit in the back of the throat. Lights failed. The ventilation cut out, and what little air remained turned hot and oily. In the ops room, consoles died with a click and a darkening of CRT greens. On the bridge, men lowered to their knees and crawled for sound more than sight, shouted names, the hiss and roar of fire, the banging of dogs on watertight doors. Somewhere below, a seaman reached for the breathing apparatus locker and burned his hand on the latch. Somewhere above, a petty officer padded along a bulkhead until his palm found a ladder too hot to grip. Damage control parties mustered fast. They counted heads against station boards, hauled hoses, and tried to trace power to the main pumps. The strike had knocked out the ship's nerve center and starved pumps of electricity. Without power, water pressure collapsed to a trickle. Fire mains bled heat. Sailors carried portable extinguishers that died to sputtering white frost after a few seconds of use. Fire curtains went up and began to sag. Bulkhead insulation lifted and dripped, burning with a soft, deadly smoke that cut visibility to arm's length. Orders moved by runner because sound-powered phones were already failing in places where cable looms had melted. The captain paced the bridge, one sleeve smudged black, eyes inflamed. He had reports of a growing fire around the operations room and down into the forward machinery spaces. He had a ship without radar, almost without radios, and a crew already pushing into their second hour breathing through wet cloths when masks ran out. He settled the ship into the swell to put the wind on the right quarter, trying to starve the fire of oxygen without letting smoke press too hard into the only routes still open for evacuation. Every course change meant a new draft of air, a new flare. HMS Arrow and HMS Yarmouth came up through white spray to help, hulls steel blue under the weak sun. Arrow edged in until her bows were nearly against Sheffield's flank. Sailors leaned over lifelines, eyes streaming from the smoke, trying to throw firefighting lines and rig portable pumps. The heat drove them back. Arrow's first hose melted at the nozzle. A second line took, but the stream disappeared into black vapor and came back as steam. Yarmouth took station and tried again from a different angle. For a few minutes the smoke lightened, and then darkened again as something new in the cable runs caught. The assisting captains did a slow ballet to keep from colliding while staying close enough to be useful, their engines straining to hold position in long swell. Inside Sheffield, the crew fought compartment to compartment. A young stoker crawled on his belly along a deck that was hot enough to score the skin through his coveralls, counting rungs in the dark to find an escape ladder he knew by touch. A chief petty officer guided 2 men by tapping 3 times on metal and waiting for 3 taps back, then moved again. They found a sailor stunned and sitting upright, eyes open but not seeing, and shoved him toward a hatch that opened to hard daylight where cold air felt like knives. They pushed on until they could push no farther. The first casualties were trapped near the impact site. The second wave were overcome by smoke in spaces that had seemed safe 5 minutes earlier. 20 men would not come home. The rest worked until their hands shook and their tongues felt like leather. The captain took another report. Fire throughout the operations room, flames forward and down, cable insulation dripping and reigniting, smoke clearing the bridge and then closing it in again. He saw the curve of his destroyer's back, paint blistered and streaked, and knew the line between bravery and waste. He ordered the ship abandoned. The word passed by shouts and hand squeezes. Men moved in single file to ladder wells lit by slits of daylight and the occasional flare of a thrown-off ember. On the upper deck, the South Atlantic wind peeled the hot stink away and left them blinking and coughing, faces blacked, eyebrows gone. They shed weight where they had to and jumped in pairs, boots cutting clean white splashes. Arrow and Yarmouth threw scrambling nets and hauled men up by elbows and webbing. The sea was cold enough to shock thought from heads. Hands that had been steady on valves and nozzles now failed at simple knots. Shipmates leaned down and grabbed fistfuls of foul weather gear and pulled until bodies thumped onto steel. From Arrow's decks, Sheffield looked both solid and impossible. She was upright, riding the swell with a slight list, but her middle was a black mouth. Smoke heaved out of every crack. Once or twice there was a soft series of thumps as something let go inside a trunking. The men who had just left her watched with an animal intensity that had nothing to do with tactics. They counted each other. They asked who had seen which messmates last. They went quiet. A boarding party later tried to return to knock down hot spots and see what could be saved. They found a maze of cables drooping like vines and a heat that had not abated. There was no power to run the ship, no safe way to rig towing points from her hottest sections. The decision hardened around pragmatism. Yarmouth took Sheffield under tow when the worst of the burning calmed. It was a slow, ugly work, cables humming, catenaries dipping into the sea and rising again with a sawed hiss. The line held, and the wounded destroyer crept north. For 6 days, the sea and weather argued with that plan. Swell worked at the twisted, heat-weakened structure. The tow creaked, and the hull answered with new sounds. Bulkheads that had been fire-thinned surrendered to long, patient force. On May 10th, remote in the gray and cold, Sheffield gave up. She rolled, settled, and slipped beneath the surface, southeast of the Falklands, a steel cliff briefly visible in the heave before the water closed. The men on the towing ship felt a tremor transmit up the cable and through their decks. They marked the position. A handful of them saluted. The South Atlantic resumed its blank face. Afterward, the paperwork and the memory began. Investigators reconstructed the minutes before impact and the minutes after, down to which circuits were up and which were down, who ordered satellite comms when, how the radar horizon and emissions control and human reaction times all braided into outcome. They found no single villain that could be stacked in front of a camera. There were consistent facts: a low-flying sea-skimming missile, a decision window too narrow, a fire that moved faster than the systems built to stop it, materials aboard that, when heated, gave off smoke that blinded and suffocated. A ship whose crew showed the mix of competence and courage every Navy hopes it has. The men who were there remembered less of the diagrams and more of the little things that bear the weight of big events. A wet rag that let a sailor breathe long enough to drag another man 2 doors along. A chief telling a young rating to keep his eyes on the deck edge and feel every step. The quiet that fell after the last jump into the water, as if even the sea held its breath. The moment on a different deck, days later, when the roll of the ship reminded a survivor of a corridor that had turned into a chimney, and he had to grip a rail with both hands until the memory passed. In the war that followed, escorts learned faster than they were built to learn. Watches stood harder. Chaff drills got quicker. Damage control kits were multiplied and redistributed. No one forgot that one missile and one spark had been enough to unmake a ship that had sailed out confident, her name a promise of steel. The promise itself survived in the ship's company, in the way they spoke about the 20 who didn't return, and in the stubborn, practical pride with which they recalled the fight to keep the rest of them alive. Thank you for listening to the Sunken Ledger. Subscribe for more true stories from the depths.